This is Diary of a Nation. I'm your host, Christina Zlotnick. My podcast explores the human experience. Be advised, this interview contains graphic descriptions of war and death and violence and may not be suitable for all audiences. New Hampshire-based photographer Patrick Patterson documents human rights and conflict. He is a witness to a death row execution, the war in Ukraine, and immigrant migration in this country. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you.
What types of organizations have you freelanced for over the years?
I've done editorial work for local publications in Texas, both regionally, and I've done work for international publications such as Gazeta Polska, which is the oldest and largest publication in Poland, Playboy publication, stuff like that.
My home state of Oklahoma ranks number 2 in the nation for the number of executions, but your home state ranks number 1.
Unfortunately, it does.
You've documented death row inmates at Huntsville Unit, which is at the Texas State Penitentiary. Could you tell me more about that work?
I followed a specific inmate named Thomas Miller L. through, at that time, he was the longest serving death row inmate. And there was an appeal, and he was on his last, his last appeal before he would be put to death. He was appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court heard his case and reversed the decision and granted him either a new trial or life in prison. He chose life in prison. There's no doubt that he committed the crime. What drew me to that particular case was the connection between the Dallas County District Attorney's Office and how they omitted Black jurors. And they had at that time they had a docket that any racial epithet that you can think of was used in that for any non-white. So basically their goal was to have an all-white jury for these convictions. And ultimately that's what the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Thomas Miller L. So I spent time with Thomas, getting to know him as a person. We obviously couldn't discuss his case in detail with the ongoing trial that was going before the U.S. Supreme Court. So, I got to know a person on Texas death row.
I imagine he was on death row for quite some time. What did he tell you as far as what his thoughts were while in prison, his fears?
We talked a lot about his early childhood growing up. We talked a lot about the things that he was passionate about, which was college basketball. Thomas and his wife, Dorothy, started to, they became addicted to drugs, and they went on a overnight crime spree in Houston and ultimately ended in Dallas. But there was someone was killed in a robbery at a hotel. And ultimately that's what ended with his arrest. But he talked a lot about basketball, sports, I guess his healthier side, because he's been incarcerated for many years. And so he's sober, and he's had a lot of time to think about what had transpired. And, ultimately the goal was not to get Thomas out of prison. I think it was, everyone knew that he had committed this crime. It was to grant him a plea deal to get him off of Texas death row.
Could you share some of the other stories of inmates that you may have come across in your work there in Texas?
Sure. The most personal connection that I had was with Thomas. I did spend time with inmates that were in charge of digging the graves for death row inmates that didn't have a place to go home to, or didn't have family members to come and pick their bodies up after that after they were executed. Spent a lot of time with Reverend Carroll Pickett. He is the Texas Death House chaplain, or was the former Texas Death House chaplain. And he was instrumental in the procedures that needed to take place for lethal injection across the United States. So he would travel to San Quentin Prison in California and kind of created the steps from the tie-down teams to how the medicine would be, or I shouldn't say medicine, but the chemicals would be injected. And ultimately, he became, from his time on Texas Death Row, he became an advocate for the Anti-Death Penalty Coalition. He was one of their lead speakers.
He was for the death penalty until he was against it.
You know, Carroll is a Presbyterian minister, and we never had the conversation if he was for it or against it when he was carrying out these executions. He was friends with the warden at the time when there was a hostage situation that took place. And so one of the hostages was a member of Carroll's church. So Carroll went to the prison at the request of the warden to almost as a hostage negotiator, somebody to try to get this woman out of the prison. Ultimately, there were people that were killed, including this hostage, but that led to the warden asking Carroll to help set up how lethal injection would take place, because at that time there was a reprieve with the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was something new. So I think he kind of stepped into that role as, well, if it's going to be done, I can try to do my part as a minister. That's
a more nuanced look. When I had read an interview that someone had done with him, he had said that was the reason that he initially supported the death penalty, was because of that prison siege. And I also know from that interview that he had acknowledged just how hard that job was for him. He said that most of the inmates would ask him, how can Texas kill people who kill people and tell people that killing people is wrong? How do you answer that question?
Well, for me, it's easy. I'm not for the death penalty. I think some of the most fascinating stories are some of the saddest stories. And after every execution, he would go home and he would make a recording, an audio diary of what his day was like. And so he did this for every single execution. So at the end of his career, he documented what lethal injection was like and the cruelty behind it. So Texas is executing inmates who have no idea what's going to happen. They have no concept of that they're going to die. And for example,
what do you mean no concept? Because they know they're on death row. Is it just that that's so far in the future that it's not even really in their current state of mind?
No, I'm saying that they don't have the mental capacity to understand that in a matter of hours, they're going to no longer be here. And one example is that Carroll was spending time with an inmate, and something that Carroll would do every execution is he would explain what would happen. So he would say, he first would offer to call any family members that that inmate wanted to speak to, would ask if that inmate would want to have some prayers. And at that time, the inmate would arrive at the Walls unit the night before and spend the night there. Now, inmates arrive the same day that they're executed. So at that time, Carroll would sit in this very dark, damp, 4-cell hallway. One of the cells is a shower, and the other 3 are holding cells. And then there's one door at the end of the hallway, and there's a phone. And when that door opens, it goes into this sterile, what I could say would look like a surgical room without the equipment. And the table looks just a little different. But Carol was walking this inmate through his day. At this time, the warden's going to come in and say that it's time. You're going to walk with me to the end of the hall. I can't hold your hand during the procedure. I can rest my hand on your ankle to let you know that I'm there. And then he would describe the steps of the process of which chemicals were going to flow and what they would do to the body. And the entire time, this inmate is coloring in a coloring book. And he looked up and said, "Carol, can you please pass me the red crayon?" And he just had this smile on his face and was happy and jolly and was very kid-like. And those are the moments that I think about as a country and specifically as a state. This mindset of, you committed this crime, we're going to kill you, an eye for an eye. And it goes against almost everything that you hear and preached in churches, right? Redemption and forgiveness. And we're all human and we're all capable of doing things that we don't think we are or we don't think about. It's the same thing with the potential of being homeless. And we don't know what life event that we're going to have that's going to propel us into the space that we call our current state of mind. So for me, my time on Texas death row, seeing and knowing the cases that innocent people were killed, and people who were killed that had no concept of that they were going to die.
So killing a man, whether that killing is committed by the criminal or by the state, creates suffering beyond the more obvious suffering of the victim. The inmate suffers, the executioners suffer, the loved ones suffer, the witnesses suffer. How can your work help?
I think today, with how political and either far right or far left, I think it's getting harder to sway people. But if that work stops, or if that information doesn't get out there, then nobody would know that these things were happening. For me, I do it as a document, as whether it's written, oral, or through a photograph. It's proof that something happened, something existed. History doesn't repeat itself. History is either fluid or it's stagnant, but it's never the same, because history is it's a testament that something existed.
It repeats itself, but not in the same way, right? Or no, in your mind?
Can you give me an example when history has repeated itself?
Well, I think there are lots of instances where history repeats itself, but not in the same exact way. We have continuing genocide, for example.
Certainly. I understand. I
guess what I'm saying is, explain what you mean a little more by that.
Sure.
Not that I'm challenging you per se.
So history is something that is very unique to the people and places that something's happening. And that's never going to happen again, identical to what occurred.
Right.
And so when we say that history is going to repeat itself, it's going to cycle back through, then we're saying that everything that happened before it didn't exist, because we're removing part of those people, part of those experiences that happened. And I guess that's what I mean by history doesn't repeat itself.
Why did you transition away from your work on death row?
I think at some point we find a stopping point. Whether I feel the that I've been able to share what I've wanted to share. I don't want to get locked into one particular subject for forever. I want to move on, and I can only store so many stories inside my body before I need to free them up. And by freeing those up, I mean by sharing those stories. Each story that happens scars you on the inside, and it leaves a small little mark. And the more people that you put yourself in front of and ask the questions, can I hear your story? The more scars you get. And my goal is to work organically and go to the places that I feel a connection to or a pull from. Even when I work daily, I try to not have a preconceived notion of what my day is going to be like. I want to work as organically as possible. I want to have one person steer me towards the next person that steers me towards the next story.
There was a scarring event at the end of your work.
For me, I ultimately was assaulted after an execution that I was leaving, and it was I was pretty young and naive, and found myself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was an eye-opening experience. It helped create who I am today. I think going through any traumatic experience never goes away. It always, it's something that, trauma is stored in your body. And for me, I had to find a way to move past that. And I needed to try to find something that was positive from that. And that was understanding that, what it felt like to be targeted, for being who I am, and, to experience the pain that I experienced during that situation.
Is that the only execution you witnessed?
So I've only witnessed one execution. As a witness, I have. I was there to witness and record what it's like around Texas death row on execution day. To speak and talk to the families that have been impacted by either their loved one on death row who's being executed, or the family members who were there to witness the person that killed their loved one.
What was that like for you emotionally?
I think in the when you're in it, it's hard to react emotionally that way. And what I'm saying is for me, I tend to become emotional, or I start to process what I've experienced or heard after I've completed something, or it could be the next day. When I'm working, certainly there are times that I'm struck by something that I find emotional or difficult or hard, but I start to feel it, all the things that come with that post doing the story.
Do you have other stories to share?
Specifically from death row? No, not particularly. That it was 20 years ago. So it's some of the first work that I focused on. I focused on the stories of migrants and immigrants traveling specifically from our southern border to the Midwest to find work, and trying to humanize them as people, and try to tell the stories that they cry, laugh, have heartbreak, work, contribute just as any other person in this country, whether they're a citizen or not.
Tell me more about those stories.
I've always wanted to share stories that pull me closer to them. So there was something about the people that I was around and that wanted me to amplify them as people, especially during a time when ICE was in Madison, Wisconsin, just kind of going around to different parts of the community that had a high migrant
targeting.
100%, absolutely. And what was kind of cool is local law enforcement didn't want ICE there, and made it very clear to this population that they had no interest in turning them into ICE, and businesses would have reduced staff, and some of them would pay these staff members to stay at home until ICE left the community. But in this particular body of work, I created, it's the only color body of work that I have. I created these portraits that are 30 by 36 inches. So they're in your face. You can't miss them. And that's my whole point with these portraits, is that for me, this is a group of people that isn't seen in a positive light by so many. And if they are seen, it's always in the negative.
Can you humanize some of those people you came across?
Sure. Timo was somebody who left a small town outside of Mexico City. He left his brother, who was a dentist there. His father was a professor at a university. His mother was a elementary school teacher, and he wanted a change in life, and he came to the U.S. and was he contributed to the community. He was an amazing hard worker. He paid taxes through his payroll taxes. So that's the other misconception, is that undocumented workers aren't paying taxes, and some of them aren't, but also many of them are.
And not getting the benefit in return, not getting the Social Security on the back end.
Absolutely. But everyone that I spent time with, they were unique in themselves, as we're all different humans. But what I took from it is that they're people. And I say that about all the photographs that I take. I can almost end any conversation that I have about the work that I create, is that these are people. These are human beings that they have a voice, but no one wants to listen to it. No one hears it.
It's when we dehumanize people that we really start to get into trouble as governments.
Sure.
That's well documented, no matter what the issue.
Absolutely.
War, immigration.
Yep.
Death row. Do you have other stories of immigrants you'd like to share?
Francisco, when he traveled to the U.S., the night before leaving, he had this small party with his mom and his two sisters, and him and his best friend at 13 traveled to Mexico City from Puebla. And from Mexico City, they hooked up with a small group of people, and they ended up traveling to a small holding, safe house about 100 miles outside of or about 100 miles from the border, near Nogales, Arizona. And the coyotes, when they brought them across, Francisco was caught, and he went to immigration, to the detention center there, and they put him across back in the Mexico side. One of the coyotes claimed to be his parental guardian. So he went back to Mexico, and the very next day did it again, and he made it across. So he just talked about his journey walking through the desert and just being thirsty and hungry, and talked a lot about rattlesnakes, and not being able to travel at certain times. And he ultimately went from Nogales to El Paso, or Nogales to Tucson, Tucson to El Paso. And from El Paso, he went to Houston. Houston got into a different van and made it to the McDonald's parking lot in Madison, Wisconsin, where he got to see his dad. So I think about the 13-year-old experience in that journey. And I think about the 13-year-old girl that I met at the Ukraine border, who traveled with her best friend alone, hundreds of miles a week after the war started. And then I think about my journey at 13, and nothing compares to these struggles. And so there are some parallels to forced migration, or migration that's been predetermined that they just want to make.
How do you process the pain, the trauma you've seen, you've felt across your work?
I'm not sure if I will ever fully process it. I think for me, it's learning to live with asking people to share their stories with me that are the worst times of their life. They're the worst thing that they've experienced, whether it's losing a loved one to an execution, or a life experiencing journey from their home to their new home, or experiencing war in Ukraine. All of these experiences will forever stay with me. And when I ask people to share their stories, I now carry the responsibility to share their stories. And if I don't, then I'm just asking people to share these horrible incidents just for the sake of me listening.
Let's pivot to your work in Ukraine during the war. How many trips have you made?
I've made 4 in total. I made one the first week of March. I went to the Ukraine-Poland border to specifically focus and witness the refugee crisis, and wanted to have a better understanding of what it looked like, what it smelt like, the sounds, and to understand why this particular country was welcoming so many refugees, opening their homes and their doors. At that same time, in northern Ethiopia, there's a civil war, and there's 500,000 deaths due to war and famine, and it's not even on the news. And there's refugees there, and doors aren't opening. Doors aren't opening from Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees. And I'm not saying that it's not okay that Poland and other countries had this response. I just wanted to kind of think about why that was happening. And ultimately, it led me to want to get a better understanding of what was happening inside Ukraine. And so I went back in June, and then I went back in end of July, and then ultimately I decided to relocate there. So I've spent the last year living in Kyiv, and then working all along the front line, and spending time in the West in some military hospitals.
Are you planning to go back?
Right now, I'm focusing strictly on taking the body of work that I have right now and getting that out to the world, sharing it to as many audiences as I can. At some point, I made the decision to come back to the U.S., and I want to focus on sharing the stories that I have.
When did you get back most recently?
I got back mid-June.
While you were there, you were at times under attack by drones, missiles, artillery fire.
Mm-hmm.
You even brought back some missile fragments. How did you find the courage to go to Ukraine knowing that being killed could have been a real threat?
I think we first need to stop and ask ourselves, we could die any day for any reason. And for me, I always gave the example of driving from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Boston. You know, how many car accidents happen between that stretch every day and how many people die. And of course, the longer you're there, your odds increase. So for me, it was a statistical game, not game, but I looked at it in statistics, and the odds are I was going to be okay. There were times that wasn't the case.
How scary did it get?
In the moment, when things happen, when you find yourself in a shelling situation, your adrenaline kicks in, and you don't necessarily feel that fear right away. I think afterwards, when you process it, you understand what type of situation you put yourself in. And you, at least for myself, I would feel it more so after the fact. In the Kherson region, standing on the street, having artillery shells coming in, landing next to you, where you have to dive on the ground. All you're thinking about, or all I'm thinking about, is how do I leave here? How do I get back home? And in May, the intensity of attacks that Russia is inflicting on Kyiv, and when I say Kyiv, I'm mostly meaning citizens, people who have no military affiliation. They are babies, children, moms and dads and grandparents living and trying to work and survive. And in May, every single night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., there were drones and missiles that would come into Kyiv, and sometimes up to 30 at a time. And to kind of paint a picture, on some of these nights, all these missiles and drones that are coming in, they carry their noises. Whether it's we call them mopeds. They sound like flying mopeds is what a drone would sound like. And a missile sounds like a roaring jet coming towards you. And then they explode, whether they're intercepted or not. They still have the sounds of their munitions exploding. And each of these is taken out of the sky with air defense. So if you have one drone and air defense misses it 3 different times, that's 3 explosions on top of the explosion that happens when they finally do hit it. So personally speaking, I did not really sleep in the month of May. Towards the end of May, I would sleep with my clothes on. It allowed me to leave my apartment quicker. And there's 3 phases to that. So I would get an alert that MiG fighters or the Tu-95 bombers had taken off. So in that case, I know that I have 3 to 4 hours before those bombers get to the launch line. So I have time to prepare. I can finish cooking my dinner if I'm cooking dinner. I can take a shower, or I could take a nap and set my alarm. And then I could move to the shelter once it got closer to that time. The other scenario is that the alarm would go off, and it could be incoming drones, and that's going to be relatively immediate. So it could be within minutes, or it could be an hour. But I got pretty good at looking at the map in other regions as the alarms would go off and I could have an idea of if a drone attack was going to be coming into Kyiv and approximately when that would happen. And then there were the Kinzhal ballistic missiles that the alarm goes off and you have 2 to 3 minutes to get to a shelter. So you have to weigh your options. And if you can't get to a shelter, the safest spot right now is between 2 interior walls.
What has Russia done to Ukraine?
They're doing the same thing that they've done to it historically. And you can go back to Holodomor with Stalin, where 5 million Ukrainians were literally starved to death. You have babies that are and children that are experiencing war. And then you have grandparents and great grandparents that are dying again, or they're dying towards the end of this war. And so you have generations that have lived Holodomor and through Stalin, and who have lived through occupation from Nazi Germany, and they are reliving Russian occupation. They've lived a life of conflict, of suffering, and of war. And you have a new generation that is experiencing occupation again. But all with this happening, you still find so much beauty within Ukraine, and you can still feel the importance of culture and family traditions. And so even in the middle of war, depending on where you are in Ukraine, you can still get glimpses of normalcy. But everybody still feels that at any minute a missile can fall wherever you are in Ukraine. So that never goes away.
What did you smell?
The death of the smell of death is a very distinct smell. And I've smelled bodies being exhumed from mass graves in Izum, babies, soldiers, entire families that were killed at the same time. In many of these mass graves, you have up to 7 or 8 family members, entire families, grandparents, siblings, moms and dads, entire generations completely gone in a matter of seconds. Smelled the rotting flesh of Russian soldiers in the forest. But I've also, smelled the pristine air of the Carpathian Mountains. And, like I said, it's there's, depending where you are in Ukraine, you can have the war at your feet in seconds.
What else did you see?
Seeing the brutality that's taking place from Russian soldiers, talking to women and children that have been raped, and speaking with volunteers that are requesting abortion kits to abort these babies that are consequences of Russian soldiers raping women and children. Spoken to people that have been a part of torture chambers, and where they are getting injections to keep them awake. And they're trying to be forced to say that they're loyal to Russia. I've seen communities completely devastated. None of it. It just, I keep always saying, like, why? Like, when you come into a rural village that is just farmhouses and farming communities that are completely destroyed. This wasn't a military site. War comes to the doorsteps of so many as that line moves back and forth. And people need to understand that it's real. People are dying. The mental trauma that's going to impact this country is going to be with so many people for a very, very long time. Farm fields are completely filled with thousands of mines. Farmers are dying every single day trying to raise food. And I keep thinking back to the Great Famine where people were starved to death, and this is another genocide, right? When we're trying, Russia is trying to eliminate a group of people. They're also recently, I think as of this week, they backed out of the grain deal, and so even outside of Ukraine, people are going to feel the impacts of food supply more than they ever have.
What did you see in the eyes of the people you photographed?
I think some of these people have been so hurt and torn apart that they haven't had time to grieve. I see fear. I see exhaustion. But I also see hope and the will to survive and live. This isn't new to Ukrainians. If you ask a Ukrainian, like this makes sense to them. They've always had Russia on their doorstep, beating them up. So historically, Russia and Ukraine have never really had a great relationship. Russia's inflicted brutality on Ukrainians for a long time.
I believe you have kids, and I've seen your photographs of kids. How do those kids appear to you in Ukraine?
I can look at a child and through their emptiness in their eyes, or what I would call their catatonic stare, can tell if they've experienced trauma or if they're children that have, found themselves in Western Ukraine and have avoided a lot of the fighting. Children are being kidnapped from Ukraine every single day and forced to Russia and Belarus. Children in the east and in some of these communities and villages are being forced to learn the Russian propaganda. Their education has shifted from a Ukrainian school to essentially now a Russian school, pro-Russian school. So in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine in Donbass and Luhansk, the same thing started to happen there, right? So children that were entering kindergarten or first grade have now spent, since 2014, this amount of time learning the narrative through the Russian lens, through Russian propaganda. So how do you repair that? How do you
undo that?
How do you reverse that? And so, even when Ukraine takes back their territory, the next set of challenges is how do you undo that? And so this war is far from being over, and the impacts are going to be so vast, from structural to ADA services, or just wounded veterans who are now in wheelchairs and on crutches and can't walk. Ukraine's not set up for accessibility. Cars are parked on sidewalks. It's considered a parking lot. Wheelchair ramps and access to buildings that would fit ADA standards are pretty much non-existent.
What photos did you not take?
I wanted to focus on the impacts of war, and specifically how war impacts civilians and those living under occupation, and the impacts that war has on environment. So I chose not to make a bunch of photographs of soldiers fighting. For me, I want to pay attention to the pot of borscht that has been sitting on a countertop for months, with the sink removed and stolen by Russian soldiers, with the soup ladle sitting next to it and a cutting block that still has dried bread mixed in with debris from the missile that hit this person's apartment. I want to focus on these small, subtle, what I call artifacts of war, because these are the emotional stories that have the chance of shifting someone's perspective or mind. And when people hear statistics in battleground, who's moving this direction and how much aid is being sent in, there's no emotional context to that. It's the business of war. And when the world saw what happened in Bucha and would see the woman laying next to her bike who was murdered by Russian soldiers with a sack of potatoes laying next to her, simply riding her bike down the street. When the world saw these images, the world responded, and mainstream news is not getting the human. They're not humanizing this war anymore. It's a war of stats. It's what dignitaries are traveling to Ukraine. Stop talking about Putin right now. Start talking about the woman in the village who hasn't eaten in days and weeks. The families that have artillery shells landing next to their home for 7 months. Let's talk about the rape of children and women, and these bodies put in to the dirt with notes attached to them, who they are, and some of them don't even have the notes that can inform people who they are. But we need to start humanizing those who are being impacted and move away from the conversations of how many meters has Ukraine moved forward in Bakhmut, or how many soldiers were lost today. And if we can take that narrative and change it to talking about who's being truly impacted by this war, I think that we can change perspective.
Could you share the first names and some brief stories of those people who you photographed in Ukraine?
Dmitry is a lawyer from Kyiv, mid-40s, married, has children. And on the day of the war, he put down his law books and picked up a rifle. And he joined a volunteer group of soldiers in the Hostomel, Kyiv area. So that first push into into Kyiv, he was a part of. He was a part of that, and he shared a very personal, intimate story that I was so thankful that he took the time to share. And he talked about what it's like to be human and his moral compass. And he told me the story of when he raised his rifle and put the bead on a young Russian soldier who was very close to him walking across the road. He said that he couldn't manage to pull the trigger. And he talked about how he values his own life, and he knows the value of his family's life. And he just couldn't manage to squeeze the trigger and take this young Russian soldier's life. And a half hour after that, this same soldier is part of the storm that rushed the Ukrainian soldiers in this very intense battle. And so odds are this young Russian soldier killed his fellow Ukrainian soldiers in that battle. There's no idea or way to figure out what really happened, but the point of the story is that, you know, this war is filled with ballet dancers and actors and poets and artists and teachers and moms and dads that have not been trained to be soldiers, that picked up a rifle and chose to defend their country. And it's a very different narrative than you hear from a lot of the young Ukrainian soldiers who are a typical 21-year-old person, right? You know, they're trying to keep their morale up. They're motivated on, you know, how many Russian soldiers that they can kill. They're getting hyped up about that. And here's this 45-year-old lawyer who's become a volunteer soldier sharing a story that he wasn't able to kill in the middle of this war, even knowing that this was the bad guy. This was the Russians that were coming in, killing children and women and anyone that they could come across. But that story really hit me in a way that it was unique. It wasn't fluffed. It was as raw as it could get. And so that's a story that I take with me.
Victor's story also hit me. Could you talk about him?
Certainly. Victor lived in a multi-story apartment block in Izum on the non-occupied side of the Donetsk River. The Donetsk River runs right next to his apartment. I would, 50 yards from the apartment. So it's this beautiful view looking out at some pastures and different parts of the city in the distance. And nine days into the war, most of the people still in this apartment block were living below ground. There were Russian bombers that were flying overhead in the days earlier. Victor's an electrician. He set his family up in the electrical room below their family's apartment. And in other parts of the basement area, there were kind of individual separate rooms that people would stay in. So in all, there's a estimated around 60 people were living below ground. And he would talk about at night, you couldn't see, and people would sing Ukrainian songs. People would celebrate Ukraine, even though across the river there was fighting. And one morning after eating breakfast, his granddaughter asked him to make tea. And so he cooked their meals and made tea on his balcony on the second floor. So he decided to go up and make tea for her. And his wife said, "Misha, wait, I'll go with you." And so he stood, as he's standing in the doorway, she's putting on her shoes, and the missile hits. And so in a matter of seconds, this building is split into two. It's a delayed detonating bomb, which allows it to travel through multiple floors before it detonates. So he described it as a thousand explosions in his ears at once. So he was knocked unconscious and was buried under rubble. And when he awoke, I think he said it was between 3 and 4 hours after the explosion, he finally freed himself, and he made it to the first floor, dropped to his knees, and cried out, "Oh God, oh God." And I believe it was 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks after that, they were able to start to finally start recovering the bodies. So this is in an area that became occupied shortly after the explosion. So Russians wouldn't allow them to retrieve the bodies, and they wouldn't provide the heavy machines to remove the rubble. So the rubble was removed by hand and by shovels and archaic tools. All the people that were murdered in that missile blast, with the exception of 7, were buried in these mass graves in Izum on the outskirts of the city.
When I asked you about Victor, you had mentioned the name Misha. So I'm thinking that maybe...
Misha is his nickname.
Same person.
Same person.
Got it. Okay. He never was a drinker, and now he is.
I'm sorry, there's 2 Victors.
Okay, so the man that we talked about initially, his formal name is Victor, but he goes by Misha.
Correct.
And there's another man.
I know who you're talking about now, in Boryanka. Mm-hmm.
What's his story?
So Victor lives in Boryanka, one of the first cities that, on the day the invasion happened, started having missile attacks, and Boryanka was occupied. And during the occupation, a gentleman by the name of Victor found himself walking, looking for water. And as he got closer to his apartment, returning, Russian soldiers at gunpoint forced him to strip and remove all of his clothes so that they could look for Nazi tattoos. And he did this during the day and in his community, in front of everyone that was living in that apartment. And so he said it was one of the most difficult days of his life to stand there wearing no clothes, having these Russian soldiers who were kids poke fun of him, make fun of his body, tell him that he was going to die, that he was a rat. One of the Russian soldiers said, "Let's kill him." The other one said, "No, he's going to die anyways. Let him go back to his home." And his home was hit by a missile, and so he lived in it. When I spent time inside his home, one whole wall was completely gone, exposed to the outside elements. And this is February. And Now he has plastic sheeting set up to prevent wind and water to come in. But at that time, there was no protection of missiles. There was no protection of Russian soldiers. Victor didn't drink. And the first thing that he does now when he wakes up every day is he drinks as much vodka as he can so that he can forget all the things that he saw and experienced.
You're self-supported. How can people help the people of Ukraine?
I think people need to find an NGO that fits their moral compass and it feels good to them, and support Ukraine through making financial donations. It's very difficult to, I've gotten in conversations with people about how much aid that they're supplying Ukraine and how much aid that they're shipping over there. And what happens is that some of this aid gets sent over and it gets held, and it takes a long time for that to get dispersed amongst the people that need it. And that, especially when it's coming from the United States. So unless you're the U.S. military donating stuff or part of that coalition, money is the most helpful thing. Money, when you make that donation, it's coming from within Ukraine, and it's also coming from Poland, where those supplies can be purchased, or Germany. So finding an NGO that fits your moral compass and making those financial contributions. I'm self-funded, so I didn't file a single story while I was in Ukraine. I filed my first one last week upon my return. So I wanted to be able to go there and work and focus on the stories and not get bogged down with an editor asking me to spend a certain time in certain areas. I wanted to work freely, and really my goal for my work is to do more academic lectures and community conversations, sharing the stories that I've gathered, and allowing my photographs to be windows into these stories. So through academic lectures and gallery exhibitions, that's my platform. People can certainly purchase prints that can help offset the costs that I've endured. But yeah.
Which NGOs in particular do you respect?
United 24 is a very large NGO, but in our community, there is a fabulous group of people who live in New Hampshire who have personally donated, over $1 million of their own money, in addition to setting up some amazing resources in Poland and in Ukraine. And that's the Common Man group. Common Man for Ukraine is its own separate group now. And they're providing mental health support for so many children that have been impacted by this war. And they're doing it the right way. And, Alex and Lisa and other members of that group are in and out of Ukraine often. They spent Christmas there with a lot of the children, singing Christmas songs and just trying to lift their spirits as much as they could. But they're doing a lot of amazing mental health support, and they're specifically working with refugees.
The Common Man chain of restaurants.
Correct.
Here in New Hampshire.
Yep, Alex Ray.
Finally, let's talk about your camera.
Sure.
How many photos do you think you've taken over your lifetime?
I have no idea. Too many.
Have you always used the Leica monochrome?
I've the Leica monochrome is relatively new in the realm of I guess like digital photography. And when I say new, it in the last 10 years. But I started making photographs when digital didn't exist. So I've always had a Leica. I shoot with my grandfather's 1935 Leica. It's a film camera, obviously, and I've shot Leica the entire time that I've been making photographs. But I've also shot with large format and medium format cameras as well.
I don't really have a good eye for photography. I don't understand how to compose. But when I do see your photos, I see the light, the good composition of light and dark. That's what I notice.
Well, the word photography comes from the Greeks, right? It literally translates to writing with light.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
When you wake up today and you get through your entire day without a missile landing near you, or hearing the sounds of tank tracks, or the sound of artillery coming and going, when you wake up every day and you have this sense of security that this doesn't exist around the world. It doesn't exist within communities in the United States. I think about the trauma that I endured, and the PTSD that I have. And I think about the communities within the United States that experience that in a different way. So it's not just in Ukraine. It's not just in the United States. It's conflict and war have always been a part of humanity. I think specifically with Ukraine, understanding that Ukraine needs more help than we're providing. The United States and other Western countries have one foot in Ukraine and the other foot out. Currently, we're talking about Ukraine's making pushes or advancements in meters, and in some areas Russia is doing the same. So Russia has had time to dig in literally to the earth there and fortify their front line, and as mines are being removed to make advancements, planes are dropping more mines in fields. And I've always thought of this war right now as a hostage situation where there's two outcomes for Putin. Putin can leave Ukraine and withdraw all the troops, and it's over, which he's not going to do. Or he can commit suicide. It's that I look at it as that murder-suicide situation where somebody's so far into it that they feel like their only out is to, and when I say commit suicide, I'm using that as a metaphor of whether it's the Zaporizhzhia power plant or using tactical nuclear weapons in some of these larger cities. But what the U.S. and other Western countries have continued to do is they say that they don't want to arm Ukraine with certain weapons because they don't want to upset Putin in fear of the nuclear response he could have. And then months later, we end up supplying these very same weapons. And it's happened with the tanks. It's happened with jets. It's happened with, we've now sent cluster munitions over. So this war is not going to end until the United States and other Western countries have both feet inside Ukraine. I just don't see any other out.
Thank you for sharing such an important conversation.
Thank you.
The fundraising platform United24 can be accessed at u24.gov.ua. You can support Patrick's work by buying his photos at williampatrickphotography.com. Not only do I host a podcast, I also write Substack essays under the name Diary of a Nation. Look for an upcoming photo essay on my Substack where Patrick will be collaborating with me and sharing the photos of some of the people whose stories you heard today. Just for podcast listeners like you, I'm offering a 20% discount on a Substack subscription. Simply navigate to diaryofanation.substack.com/podcast offer. Each link referenced in this episode is also available in the show notes. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Diary of a Nation.